Alrighty, so I talked about form validation in the last section. So now we're actually going to implement some and do a fairly simple approach to it. So create a new folder. I thought about it after reviewing last time because I think I had put 16 for last time, so I changed that to 15. Hopefully you saw that. And then copy the ending code from user input that we did and clear or create their README file and then code along with me and we'll go from there. Okay, so I have where we ended up last time, right? I have it running in live server and we're ready to get going. So a couple things I want to start with just simple things we can do inside the HTML still. I'm going to go ahead and do both screens so that I have the HTML and I have the JavaScript up. One of the things you can do right now where we have text for each of the inputs, right? So the inputs are where we have a tag for the user input itself. Right now we have text, and I'd kind of talked about this and talked about why we had to use parse int to convert because it is coming in as a string, right? So that's why we ended up having to use parse int. So there's another attribute we can use besides text that would be number. Okay, so go ahead and update each of these to number and we'll see what this does to the form. Okay, so update those to number and then let's switch over to the form here. And now what's kind of nice is if a user, which the thing about form validation is you have to assume users do the wrong thing, which as users we often do. So if I tried before I had done this, maybe I should have started with that. If I had tried to put in ABC, it would have let me, but now it actually prevents me from typing in ABC, whatever. Okay, I have to type in new. As a matter of fact, it even gives me, like, if I put in 10, right, it would increment those. So it's just nice functionality. Again, this kind of stuff is what we call minimal. Like there's also ways that people who know enough about forms, HTML, can kind of get around some of this, but from a beginning standpoint, it is a good start. Okay, so that's the first thing is we can just change that to number. So now what if, right? So if we come up here and we go, okay, so if I assume at this point that I'm at least getting some input here, right? So what would I want to validate for? Well, how about if I put 0, right? If I put 0 and I put 0, well, then I'm going to get not a number, right? And which is not great. And notice also how this is actually outside of here. I'm going to fix that real quick in CSS just to show you how to do it. As kind of a little, again, CSS is good to know how to do. So right now we have the form that has all the styling. So what I could do here is I'm going to add a class. I'm going to call it centered. Okay. And I'm going to take all that content from here, from that form, and I'm going to place it here, get rid of that form. And now whatever I want styled in this way, I can just apply this class to it. So over here in the HTML, which I already have here, okay, what I could do here is just say class equal centered. Let's see what that does. Well, it doesn't change anything, but what it allows me to do now is wrap this entire thing in a div. Okay, just do this, including the output. Okay, and by the way, I like to do A and then okay. And the reason I do this is to make it readable for me and for anybody else looking at my code. So I just added a div that wraps everything in the body, which, by the way, there's actually better semantic uses like main we could use here as well. But I'm trying to keep it simple. Okay, so now I can say class equals centered. I know how to spell it. The nice thing is I can take it off here. Okay. Nice. And now when I enter, in, low numbers. Then I get that content in here. And we will start talking about, I know I have my screen kind of larger, like smaller, sorry, mostly because I'm just trying to have it all on the screen, have it all here, because I can have my form larger, but my content over here a little bigger. But the other thing we'll start talking about later is how when you refresh the page, the content goes away, the output. And that's because it is not persistent. And we'll learn about ways, kind of simple ways to make data persist, meaning after after the page has been refreshed. Okay, so we got that done. And now we have it all wrapped in a centered div, which is nice. We got that CSS done, just kind of evolving our form as we go. So now let's think about some simple validation. Now that we know you have to enter a number, okay, can you just enter 0 as I showed before? And the answer is yeah, you get an error message. So we don't want users to be able to do this. So how do we fix this? Well, let's fix this by after the prevent default, let's say const, and let's say error MSG. So this is where we're writing custom validation. We're moving from relying, which by the way, what we're about to do is available on the attributes, but I'm just going to use it as an example to show you simple validation. Okay, and then I'm going to set up a new array. All right. So after I have grabbed the values for miles, gallons, and price, then what I would do is write some logic. Okay. So I could say if, and in here I have a condition I'm going to check for. So I could say if miles, because remember miles refers to the e.target.miles.value and it's %. So if it is equal to, remember what we were talking about, not don't if you do equals here, it actually would set the value of that. And what we want to do is ask, is it actually strictly strict equality, we call it. Okay. So is it equal to 0 and is its type numeric? So we know by doing it up here, that is true. So if it's equal to 0, right, then we want to console.log, and we'll put right here, this error message for now. We're going to end up showing you how to do it on the page. Okay. So if miles was 0, this was 3, this was 3. We should see when I hit submit the error message here. But notice how it still runs. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not what we wanted, right? What did we want? We wanted if it was an error, then we don't want to run this. So what do we do here? Well, we can just type else. So the if else is one of the most common logic what do I call it? The most common way to write logic in any programming language. There's different versions of this. I could also do an if else here and add another condition, but for now I'm going to keep it simple because I want to just have you understand this. So what would we do here? If we wanted it to only run, right, if miles was not equal to 0, then we could just drag this up in here. Okay, look at that for a minute and think about it. By the way, I should have these a little better, clearer. Does that make sense to you? Okay, so which by the way, if this redundant, okay. So if I set a breakpoint in this event listener right here, okay, we know that this is going to check for equality, and hopefully we know, and if you don't, I'm about to show you, it will resolve to a Boolean that is either true or false. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do 0 here. So we trigger that line. We have that conditional line met. And I've stopped on the line. So we know it's equal to 0. And just to confirm, which I want to show you a little technique that when you're new at programming, you can paste it into the console. And if it's true, that means whatever's in this block, okay, is going to run. And then the else would not run because it's only going to run what's here. Okay. So we know that's true. So we know if we step into this code, then console log, boom, and notice what happens. It does not run this line. Okay. So this is a way we're using logic and conditions to check for, like, if miles equals 0, then do something else, go ahead and run, right? So if we hit the else block, right, which by the way, I'm also going to show you how to clear these fields because you need to be able to think about every time you enter something, right? Generally it clears what's in there. So now I'm going to keep that breakpoint here. Now miles, right? So what would this resolve to? In your mind, what would you say before you do this? Does miles strictly equal 0? Oh, actually, sorry. Yeah, no, it doesn't right now, right? Because why? Because miles is 2. I'm not sure why. Yeah, there it is. So now we're going to hit the else block and run this. Okay. So the first thing I want you to do in your README file is tell me, is this does this make sense to you? And if not, ask me a question so I can answer it in there. Okay. So just give me a short explanation. If it does, if it doesn't, ask me clarifying questions. I'll do my best to answer them. If I forget and I miss it, please remind me, right? Okay. Now, let's actually talk about what we would want to actually do here, because this is all good and fine, but the user's not going to see this, right? User will not see this. Well, we want to actually have the user see a message. So there's a couple ways we could do this. In the HTML, and I can either do it above or below. You see it kind of both ways. But just for today, I'm going to add another div here. I'm going to say ID so I can point to it, and I'm going to say ERR. Okay. And I'm also going to give it, we'll come back and do that actually, the second part in a minute. So we'll just give it a div. We'll call it ERR. So now in my JavaScript, I'm going to come back up here. I'm going to say constant ERR equal document dot get element by ID. And I know I've shown you get query selector, and we haven't really talked because there's another one, document query selector. You can actually get multiple items. But in most of the stuff we're doing right now, this is actually the much more efficient way to do it. And if you read something about DOM updates, they generally say, when possible, use get element by ID, unless you're querying. Okay, is query selector all. So we'll look at that sometime in the future. But for today, we're just going to say whatever that ID was, which was ERR. Okay, so now that points to that element. Okay, how do we know? Well, again, when we can do it here, actually it's on page load. Okay, so if I do page load, I should have set a breakpoint here. Okay, and when this line runs, if I roll over, right now you don't see anything because there's no content in there, but you could type ERR and it would show you there's a div and its ID is error. So now let's use that in our code. I've noticed too, if I take off those breakpoints, I don't have to handle that when I come back. So now what do we want to do, right? So if there is an error, okay, what do we want to do? Well, we actually want to push a message because we might have multiple things we're going to check for, okay? So what we would do is say ERR message, which is the array dot push, and then we would say something like make sure you input value that's long but greater than 0. Let's just leave it there. Okay. And then I might be a little snarky and say try again. Okay. All right. So if I do that, then how could I use that? Because again, I could have multiple error. And when you're doing validation, you typically do have multiple things you're checking for. So how could I use that? Okay. I could say if, right? And I push this in here. So far, so good, right? If else, right? So if I get down to here, right? If I say, actually, hold on. I think I messed up. Actually, I didn't mess up, but in a way, I realized in writing this, I didn't, because now, well, actually, let's just write it the right way, and I'll explain what I did. I just wasn't, because I've written this before. Anyway, no big deal, right? So for now, let's just go ahead and get rid of this for now, okay? For now, and actually get rid of the else. We'll come back to the else in a little bit, right? So what we'd want to do now is do another check, because we could have multiple if statements here, okay? And I could say if this array MSG dot length, in other words, dot length is greater than 0, would indicate what? Dot length greater than 0 would indicate I have a message in there, okay? And in that case, I'd want to run, sorry, in that case, I'd want to output to the browser. And here's where I'd do the else and run if the length was not greater than 0. So I'll show you this in action so you can see it, right? We'll say do output to the DOM in a minute. We're not going to use that function. I'm going to show you a different way to do it. Okay. Okay. So I'm still going almost at the point I want to halt, but let's actually complete this concept here. So what we could do here is I have access to the error. Okay. So I could do err dot text content equal to, and in this case, this, and by the way, this is just the beginning part of doing it. I could say equal to error MSG, and that is the array. Okay, so I could say output whatever messages, because again, we're going to do multiple messages here. Okay, let's see if that works. So what we're checking for is dis miles. These other ones can be whatever, right? Oh, look at that, right? So now we have some error message here, which is awesome, right? So now we're going to do some more work. We'll pick this up on the next one, right? So for now, just go ahead and say, commit this code with starting simple validation, and then we'll pick it up on the next one.